Hi Year 12, so this is Wednesday's lesson, and as I promised, I'm going to keep this quite brief, but we will start with a quick retrieval, and again, it is just getting you thinking about all of those different combinations of letters that we associate with this topic. So take a few moments and just literally write them out in full. What do the letters stand for? Okay, and having done that and recalled your knowledge, let's just double check. So failure to function adequately, of course, one of our 4 definitions. DSM-B or 5 is our diagnostic and statistical manual. ICD-10, which we haven't talked a great deal about, but it is still used internationally, and it was used in Britain for a long time, but in recent years we tend to use more the DSM. But that is just another equivalent. It's a classification of disorders, a sort of manual that you would go to. Deviation from social norms, global assessment of functioning, and deviation from ideal mental health. So I know it's lots of letters, lots of combinations, but just keep rehearsing them, keep practicing them, because you need to know them, and actually they're quite good little memory cues rather than have to remember the full phrase every single time. So just to, again, put the bigger picture here, put it into context. Last lesson, we focused around this behavioural explanation of phobias and Mauer's 2-step process, how we form a phobia in the first place through classical conditioning, and then how we maintain it through operant conditioning. And this lesson, all we're going to do is focus on evaluating that. How good an explanation for phobias is it? What are the problems with it? What examples can we draw upon to criticise it and to kind of challenge it, as well as seeing what's useful about it. So we're just going to really focus on evaluation today. Just a reminder, if you haven't yet done your quick quiz on the psychopathology topic so far, just click on the link. I'd like all of you to do that at some point during the next few days. And this is really building on from last lesson, and it's just going to help you in terms of those application questions. So I gave you this example of Kirsty, and I just asked you, rather than worry too much about answering the question, although it was only a 4-mark one, I asked you to just annotate and pull apart the item and pick out that language that we were using last lesson. So the green box at the top there is what you should have, and I hope you do, and use a green pen to kind of mark off and correct your own. Hopefully you did pick this out yourself though. So the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that happened in the very beginning, was the balloon popping in her face. But it was not so much about the balloon, it was the popping, it was the banging sound. So that's what you should have identified as the unconditioned stimulus. And the unconditioned response was, well, it created her to have an anxiety, a fear, crying, that sort of thing. The neutral stimulus, the thing that happened to be there at the time of this banging, popping noise, was the balloon. And that becomes the conditioned stimulus. We know it always does. And then the conditioned response is now she will feel that anxiety and that fear and have that panic when faced with the sight of a balloon, hence why she's avoiding situations. So we can see there's avoidance going on in this as well. So when it talks about how it might be used to explain Kirsty's phobia, if we then put that into an answer, you can see the example at the bottom there. I'm immediately referring to classical conditioning. I'm then picking the bits out from the item to say she's made an association, because we know that's what classical conditioning is, learning through an association between the balloon, and I'm just putting in brackets. I've done the hard work here when I've annotated it, and now I'm just referring to it in the item. So she's made an association between the neutral stimulus and the traumatic experience of popping in her face, the unconditioned stimulus, causing her to feel extremely anxious. That was the unconditioned response. And now she's generalized this to all balloons and will feel anxious at the sight of a balloon, the conditioned response. Now, that's one approach to this question. I could have referred to Mauer's 2-step model, and I could have brought in the idea of operant conditioning, and she's avoiding situations, and that's maintaining her phobia. So I could have gone in one of 2 ways. I couldn't do it all because it's only 4 marks, and I've got to be succinct and, be aware of the time. I don't want to spend more than a few minutes on this. But can you see how if you've done the hard work and you've picked out the key parts, then it's quite easy to then go ahead and answer the question. Okay, so if you struggled with that, now you've got the kind of the worked example, if you like, go back and have another look and think about how you can pick out those key clues from the item. So we're looking again at page 144, 145 in the textbook, but we're focusing today around this idea of evaluation and how useful is this behavioural explanation for why phobias develop and why phobias are maintained. So we'll have to zoom in onto Mauer's two-step model for a little bit and think about what's good about that or not good about that, and then zoom back out and look more generally at a behavioural explanation. So the evaluation points I'm going to sort of talk about and then ask you to do something with are all in the textbook. So you need to make sure you use that online book to help you to develop those points that I'm going to be introducing in a moment or two. So I've chosen 4 images. This one here, I don't know how clear it is. It's meant to represent heights. So what do all 4 of these phobias have in common? Heights, spiders, snakes, and dark. Obviously, they can all be phobias, but is there something you could link between them that they all have in common? Have a think. Okay, so they can all be harmful to us. I purposely chose an image of a spider that's supposed to be a poisonous spider because, of course, a normal house spider that we have in this country isn't harmful. But actually, if we think about all 4 of these things, they are actually a threat to us. Now, the evolutionary approach that we've mentioned on a few occasions now tells us that we have the behaviours that we have because it is an evolutionary advantage to us. Well, remember that old part of our brain? It protects us. It would be actually quite sensible for us to have this behaviour of phobias and feeling fearful towards things that can harm us because that protects us. It means we are going to avoid situations where we might be faced with a poisonous spider or be faced with this sort of a dangerous height. So the behavioural approach, whilst it might be very useful in trying to explain why phobias form, why we learn them, what it ignores is the fact that we might actually just have an innate, built-in evolutionary mechanism to be afraid and to be fearful of certain things because it protects us. It's for our own survival. So what we're essentially saying is that the behavioural approach, once again, is ignoring the role of nature and is ignoring the role of our evolutionary past. So that's one of the evaluation points that we can use to criticise this approach. But remember, evaluation can be positive as well as negative. So I've actually picked a positive one as my first modelled worked example at the top here. So you can see we're using that peel structure, and I'll talk a bit more about how that was used very well in some of your essays. But we know when we're doing evaluation, we're aiming for peel paragraphs. So we make our point, we then explain that point, we provide some evidence or an example, and then we link back and say, well, why does it matter? So if we look at this worked example here, the 2-step model by Maurer was more sophisticated than Watson's theory of classical conditioning. Remember, Watson did the little Albert case study for phobias, and it considered the roles that operant conditioning plays. So my paragraph is going to become one of strength rather than weakness. This is a good thing. It's more sophisticated, it's more complex. Then I'm explaining what I'm on about. So I've introduced the idea of operant conditioning here, so I need to explain that. So Maurer's second step in the process shows us that it's through the negative reinforcement that avoidance brings us that we maintain our phobia. So remember, we are Kirsty is avoiding parties because of her fear of balloons, and therefore because she didn't have a panic attack, and that meant that she'd avoided that unpleasant experience, she'll continue to avoid those situations. She'll maintain that behaviour. She maintains her phobia. So we've explained what we mean by that. We're then giving an example. So this has been useful in helping to develop treatments such as systematic desensitization, because it shows us that the person has to be exposed to the phobic object to break this cycle of avoidance. So I'm trying to pick out an example and say, so why is this a good thing? Why does this matter? And I'm also then linking back, and I'm therefore saying Maurer's 2-step model has been influential in developing effective treatments. So here my example then leads into my link back. But I've taken one evaluation point that actually this is quite good because it brings in operant conditioning and it's a bit more complex and a bit more sophisticated. And I've really expanded that to form a paragraph. I've just set it out in this table form. And what I'd like you to do, using the textbook and a little bit of input that I'm about to give, is to do exactly the same for the other ones that you can see there on the left-hand side of the table. So I've just given you an example with those 4 pictures on the previous slide that will help you with this one here. It's the behavioural explanation's an incomplete explanation. It doesn't consider the evolutionary basis. So you'd then go on to explain what I mean by this evolutionary and this idea of it protecting us. You'd give me some examples of phobias that people have, which actually, if exposed, could be harmful. And then you'd link back and say, so why is it a problem that the behavioural approach ignores all of that? A couple of others to think about. Not all avoidance behaviour. So we're thinking about the second step in Mauer's process here. Not all avoidance behaviour is actually thought to be about reducing anxiety. For example, and this is quite a specific example and you might use it here, agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is, we've said already, a specific category of phobias in its own right as identified by the DSM, and it is quite unique and quite complex, that phobia of open spaces. An agoraphobic will not only not leave their house because they don't want to have a panic attack, they will choose to stay in their house because of the security and the reward that it gives them. So Mauer's 2-step process says our phobia is maintained because of negative reinforcement. Actually, agoraphobia suggests it's often not negative reinforcement, it's actually a positive reinforcement. People are choosing, agoraphobics choose to stay at home, not just to avoid the unpleasant consequence, but to gain that sense of security and comfort that they often gain from being in their home. And we see that because agoraphobics will often be willing to leave the house if with somebody else. I used to know a lady who was agoraphobic, and it was quite strange, really, because she used to use her bike as almost a comfort, as a security thing. So she would never go out of her house if it was just her on her own without a bike. But she would happily cycle, and even if she was just walking to the shop, she would take her bike with her and she would wheel along her bike, and it was her security thing, and it was one of the ways that she dealt with her agoraphobia. So actually, it was probably more for her about the fact that she wanted to stay at home, and she gained some sort of positive reinforcement by doing that, that was maintaining her phobia. So that's an interesting evaluative point. You can explore that a bit further as well. Not all phobias follow a trauma, and often people who have a phobia cannot place a time when they experienced a trauma. In fact, they might have a phobia of something they never encountered. They might have a phobia of flying and they've never been in an aeroplane. So where's that phobia come from? And of course, we know that the behavioural approach focuses entirely on behaviours and behavioural characteristics and doesn't consider the role of cognitions, thinking. But think back to the work we did about the Stroop test, the selective attention. The behavioural approach doesn't explain any of that. We can't learn that, surely, that way of thinking. Do we really learn that by an association? It's quite reductionist, we might argue. So you'll see that you'll be able, elements of this feed into our door frame structure that we use to help us evaluate. Others are a bit more specific, and it's always good if you can use specific examples because it helps with that skill of analysis and evaluation. So what I'd like you to do is use the textbook and have a go at completing that table to really help you with developing evaluative points. Okay, so that basically concludes that part of the lesson. The only thing I would leave you with is just a couple of hints for flashcards. So you could have a flashcard and list the strengths of the behavioural explanation, and another one and list the weaknesses. The only other bit that I'm going to quickly go through is the feedback from the essays that I received. Okay, I still haven't received everybody's. I'm in school tomorrow being Tuesday, because I'm recording this on Monday, and I'm going to make a couple of phone calls to check in on people, make sure we're all okay, and see whether we can get some of those missing essays to appear. I'll have probably spoken to those individuals by the time you watch this. So those people that did send them in, I've already emailed you to tell you what your exact mark was, because I obviously didn't want to share that publicly to everybody. But what I've done here is I've just picked out a few really good examples of where people have done things really well. So in this example here, really great use of vocabulary. They were immediately starting off the paragraph with their point by talking about the fact that this deviation from ideal mental health definition is ethnocentric. And then what we see really nicely here is the peel structure. So they then go on to explain what ethnocentric means. They then provide an example by referring to the self-actualization here. So they're using the language of the definition as their example. And then at the end of the paragraph, they're linking back and saying why it matters. This is important because. So really great use of the peel structure there. Well done. Another really lovely example is an effective use and an example. This particular person throughout their essay used lots of examples. So they referred to things like anxiety. So it's showing the examiner, I'm not just regurgitating what I've read in the textbook, I'm thinking about this in the context of different disorders. So we've got this lovely one here. This person's behaviour would cause suffering to themselves and those around them. For example, someone with anxiety may be unable to leave the house. They'd be considered abnormal as it's interfering with their everyday life. So we're unpacking the failure to function adequately definition by applying it. And that's lovely. That helps you to clock up those marks. Another example at the bottom here, this one was typed, and there's a lovely example here of linking back again. This is important because if a patient's misdiagnosed, it could potentially worsen their situation. So lots of people in the essays that I've received referred to this problem of the definition not being valid or leading to misdiagnosis. And here somebody takes that a step further and tells me why it matters that you might be misdiagnosed. Well, then you're not going to receive the right treatment. It could worsen the situation. So that was really nice. One more here, and this entire this part of the paragraph is really well explained, because what we've done is we've essentially used the evaluation point of it being reductionist, and we have explained in what way it's reductionist, because it's not it's sorry, I'm just reminding myself. So this idea here, we're talking about the failure to function adequately definition, and we're saying it's subjective. It's actually suggesting that there's certain things that you must do in order to adequately function. Well, actually, some of those things could be considered lifestyle choices. So it's giving that example here, and then it's saying, so it's reductionist, because it's not exploring the full complex range of things that determine our behaviour. And some of it is our individuality, our eccentricity, and our lifestyle choices. And a scale, a quantifiable scale where we're trying to put a number onto somebody, can't really factor all of that in. So it's reductionist. So there's a lovely use of that word there, tying it all together. So this is a final example. Again, it was from a typed essay, so I've just blown that bit up a bit so it's nice and big for you to see. And really the whole paragraph is excellent. We can see the peel structure. We've got lovely use of example here with this OCD to say that actually the failure to function adequately definition has a problem here, because you can have two people with the same disorder, and one person can manage to get on with their everyday life and hold down a job, and the other person can't. Well, if they've both got the same disorder, it doesn't seem right that the definition would diagnose one as having a problem and not the other. So it goes through that and it unpacks that with the lovely example of OCD. And then at the end, we're saying, why is it important? Well, it's important because of this issue of labelling and stigma. So that was a really lovely paragraph, and some of you might be able to use that and help you to improve your own and to incorporate it in. So in terms of doing your green pen, what I've done is I'm going to try and move myself out the way. At the top there, you've just got the little bit from the spec, just to really remind you what it is we need to be able to do. And then next to each of your names, I've kind of picked out what was really good, what praise, if ordinarily what I would have been writing on your work. And then the numbers in the right-hand column where it says green pen work, correspond to these questions here. So those are the ones I want you to focus on. Of course, you could check against all of them and think, oh, I didn't do that either, I'm going to try and add that in. So don't see that as limiting, but those are the ones that really struck me you could focus on to develop and to improve your answer. Okay, but well done for those 6 people, some good essays. The 5 people that are missing, please, I need them so that I can give you the feedback as well, because I'm happy to do the same again for the other 5. And if you haven't yet done your essay, well, look at this. This is a gift. I've just given you some lovely paragraphs, some real good examples, haven't I? And we've now got some things to consider to make sure you include. So use that to your advantage and produce a good quality piece of work. Okay, so that is it. I promised it wouldn't be a full hour's lesson, and it hasn't been. So you do your green pen improvements on your essay, and you do those evaluation paragraphs for me. Just basically set it out as the table. And then we won't have a lesson on Friday because it's bank holiday, so I will be putting on next week's lessons next week as usual. Okay, so stay safe, take care. I'll speak to you soon.